Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Hooker fought at Antietam, was wounded, and returned to the Army of the Potomac for the Battle of Fredericksburg. When we left him, he had just been named the commander of the Army of the Potomac. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Joseph Hooker left Washington, D.C. and President Abraham Lincoln and returned to the Army of the Potomac. His first order of business was to reorganize the Army. He deemed Ambrose Burnside's Grand Division concept too cumbersome and got rid of that designation, leaving 7 corps with the 11th Corps being sent away. Arguably, his most important part of his reorganization was taking the sparsed-out cavalry, which was divided through the Army, and concentrated it into a single cavalry corps, like the Confederates had done. He also ordered its commander, George Stoneman, to regularly attack Confederate pickets to gain small victories to build up morale. Most historians believe this and other factors in 1863 led to the mounted arm of the Army of the Potomac to compete with and defeat the rebel counterpart. Desertions were up throughout the Army, and Hooker set about trying to curtail this massive amount of men leaving the ranks. It was estimated 200 men a day left the Army. To stop this, Abraham Lincoln issued an amnesty to all soldiers who returned to their units, and Hooker made Army life better for the soldiers, building new hospitals and renovating old ones, establishing brigade bakeries, and trying to get a variety of food issued to the men. Hooker said, "My men shall be fed before I am fed, and before any of my officers are fed." Going further, Hooker reorganized the leave system, giving men an opportunity to go home and making the punishment for unruliness the inability to get leave. In this way, he improved morale and order within the Army by using leave as an incentive. He promoted the writing of major engagements in which a regiment did service on the regimental flags. Hooker also developed the Corps Badge, so his corps, division, and brigade commanders could take pride in their units, and so they could be more identifiable on the battlefield. Alcohol and women followed the Army constantly, which became a battle to combat. Not only women, but images of them in various lewd acts made their way through the camps. One man was horrified at the large number of obscene books and prints constantly passing down through the post office to the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac. Union soldier and historian Charles Francis Adams, Jr. wrote, "During the winter of 1862-63, when Hooker was in command, the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac was a place to which no self-respecting man liked to go, and no decent woman could go. It was a combination of barroom and brothel." The administration essentially gave up trying to curtail the women of ill repute in the camps, concluding that if the officers refused to cooperate with the order, there wasn't much to be done. Most information as to the enemy's whereabouts came from scouts, deserters, civilian informants, and cavalry expeditions. Hooker helped establish the Bureau of Military Information, led by Colonel George Sharp, to compile and examine this information, which led to a more coordinated effort and more accurate information. None of these reforms would have been possible without the help of Hooker's Chief of Staff, Daniel Butterfield. Some historians even go further and believe that Butterfield was the mastermind behind a lot of the reforms. Nevertheless, Hooker deserves great credit for holding the Army together and making it better. The Assistant Adjutant General of the 2nd Corps remarked, "The Army of the Potomac never spent 3 months to better advantage." In late February 1863, Confederate cavalry crossed the Rappahannock River to gain information on Hooker's army, its whereabouts, and if it was planning to move. The report came to Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee that Hooker appeared to be staying put during the winter and not evacuating. During that rebel expedition, Hooker dispatched his own cavalry after the enemy horsemen, but the Federal cavalry didn't catch the enemy. Hooker remarked to a cavalry officer, "I know the South and I know the North. In point of skill, of intelligence, and of pluck, the rebels will not compare with our men if they are equally well led. Our soldiers are a better quality of men. They are better fed, better clothed, better armed, and infinitely better mounted, for the rebels are fully half mounted on mules, and their animals get but 2 rations of forage per week, while ours get 7. Now, with such soldiers and such a cause as we have behind them, the best cause since the world began, we ought to be invincible, and by God, sir, we shall be. You have got to stop these disgraceful cavalry surprises. I'll have no more of them. I give you full power over your officers to arrest, cashier, shoot, whatever you will, only you must stop these surprises. And by God, sir, if you don't do it, I give you fair notice, I will relieve the whole of you and take command of the cavalry myself." In mid-April, Hooker outlined his plan but kept it secret, sending Butterfield to the President personally to tell him about the plan and ask him not to divulge it. Hooker intended to cross the Rappahannock River upstream from Fredericksburg and turn Robert E. Lee's left flank. Hooker even kept his corps commanders in the dark, too scared that the word may get out and Lee would counter his thrust to the west. Rains delayed Hooker's movement, and it finally got underway at 5:30 a.m. on April 27, 1863. While Hooker moved with the larger force to the fords of the Rappahannock, he left John Sedgwick in charge of troops around Fredericksburg and for him to make an attack there, hoping to trap Lee between the two Union forces. Hooker spoke boastfully of him bagging Lee's army and talked of victory, but as his army moved across the river, a different tone began to overtake Hooker. One of his biographers explains, "A letter from Butterfield to Sedgwick, written after Hooker had retired for the night, shows that Hooker was favorably considering the possibility of taking a strong position near Chancellorsville and waiting for Lee to attack him on his chosen ground. Sedgwick was cautioned not to upset the plan by allowing his demonstration to bring on a general engagement. This was the first note of weakness to creep into the forceful moves of the last 3 days. An offensive campaign was supposedly being waged, but the general was now thinking of maneuvering in such a manner as to permit him to fight a defensive battle. But what if Lee did not choose to fight on Hooker's chosen ground? Was he to be allowed to retreat to a defense of Richmond? Was it possible that Hooker had already forgotten that his real purpose was to destroy the enemy, not just maneuver Lee out of his defenses? When John Reynolds, commander of the 1st Corps, reported to Hooker that between 3,000 to 5,000 reinforcements from Richmond were headed to confront Sedgwick on the Federal left, Hooker saw his victory as magnified if the Confederate force was larger. Hooker dashed off General Order No. 47, stating, "It is with heartfelt satisfaction the commanding general announces to the army that the operations of the last 3 days have determined that our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind its defenses and give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him." By the night of the 30th, Hooker's force was now in an area known as the Wilderness, a location that had been cut for the purpose of running an iron furnace, and the new growth brought with it a dense undergrowth and was difficult to see past a few yards. At the Chancellor House, a brick mansion, Hooker met with the cavalry commander Alfred Pleasonton. According to Pleasonton, he advised Hooker to move his army a few miles to the east, essentially out of the wilderness, to better terrain, but Hooker refused to move that night. The army commander got some sleep, confident about the coming days. A dense fog covered the army on May 1st, delaying any movement by the army had Hooker ordered such an advance. By 11 a.m., the corps commanders were ordered to push east through the wilderness, and Sedgwick was ordered to make a demonstration against the enemy to his front until further orders were given. It wasn't long before the Union columns began to march, and they began to run into stiff Confederate resistance. When Hooker got the news, he was in a state of hesitation. The immense responsibility of every decision from this point on was weighing heavily upon him. In the past, when he had been in command of a division or corps, there had always been someone else to make the chief decisions, and someone for him to criticize later. Now it was all Hooker. The self-confidence fostered since boyhood was ebbing fast. Perhaps he had missed the stimulant, which he had resolved to deny himself. Fighting Joe had gained his reputation as a stand-up fighter, but he had hoped to prove by his direction of the army that this was not his only military accomplishment. Upon hearing the news, Hooker ordered his advanced units to retreat, leading one historian to write, "When he called in his advance, the battle became Lee's, not his. He was still commander of the Army of the Potomac, but Lee was commander of the field of battle." Hooker paced on the front porch of the Chancellor House and remarked to Corps Commander Darius Couch, "It is all right, Couch. I have got Lee just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground." On the morning of May 2nd, Hooker rode around his lines to examine his defenses and was content at letting Lee attack him or attack if the opportunity may arise. During the day, Hooker got reports that Confederates were moving toward Culpeper, and it was suspected that all of Lee's army was in retreat. But even if Hooker believed this, he didn't mount a pursuit. Daniel Sickles and his 3rd Corps advanced and attacked a column of Confederates and took some prisoners. That evening, Hooker was on the porch of the Chancellor House listening to the artillery fire on the left of his line when one of his staff members looked down the plank road through his field glasses and yelled, "My God, here they come!" The troops Hooker saw and reported to him as Lee's army in retreat had been Stonewall Jackson's corps moving around to the Union right flank and had struck Olive Otis Howard's 11th Corps. Hooker quickly mounted his horse with his staff and hurried down the road, passing frantic pack animals, camp followers, and scared soldiers from the 11th Corps. Hooker knew he needed fresh troops and thought of the 1st Corps. He had ordered them from Fredericksburg that morning, and they should be close at hand. Coincidentally, the leader of the 1st Corps, John Reynolds, rode up and said his men weren't across the river yet. A faulty telegraph and a lost dispatch delayed the notification of the order to Reynolds. Next, Hooker thought of Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps. One division was held back from that corps while the rest advanced in an attack on what was thought to be the retreating rebels. Fortunately for Hooker, it was his old division. It was close at hand, and he rode up to its commander and good friend, Hiram Berry, and said, "General, throw your men into the breach. Receive the enemy on your bayonets. Don't fire a shot. They can't see you." Despite the chaos of the evening attack on Hooker's lines, a defense was put together, and with Stonewall Jackson and his second-in-command, A.P. Hill, being wounded, the attacks ground to a halt in the darkness. During the night, the 1st Corps made it to the battlefield, making it unmistakable to Hooker that he outnumbered any Confederate force on the field, but he wanted to remain on the defensive. Not knowing where an attack might commence the next morning scared Hooker. On the morning of May 3rd, Hooker rode along his lines, making sure they were prepared for an assault. At 7:30 a.m., he came across a group of men standing around a prostrate body. He asked, "Who have you there, gentlemen?" When the answer came, General Berry, Hooker dismounted and bent over the dead body, saying, "My God, Berry, why was this to happen? Why was the man on whom I relied so much to be taken away in this manner?" The death of Berry greatly affected Hooker, and he became more despondent. Henry Slocum, the 12th Corps commander, informed him that the advanced line needed ammunition, both for the infantry and the artillery. Hooker simply said he couldn't make soldiers or ammunition. Despite the Confederate attacks, Hooker didn't order in the available troops from the 5th or 1st Corps to help. It seemed as if Hooker had lost his nerve and was at a loss at what to do. General Sedgwick near Fredericksburg hadn't been able to make headway, but Hooker wired him a message telling him to attack and that was an order. After that, Hooker stood on the porch of the Chancellor home. A staffer from the 3rd Corps dismounted in the yard and walked up to the porch with a message. Hooker bent over the rail to grab the message. Just then, a 12-pound solid shot from one of the Confederate artillery pieces slammed into the pillar near Hooker. It split, and part of it hit the general in the side and head. Hooker was stunned. He was taken into the house, and the rumor began to spread that Hooker was dead. After 5 minutes, Hooker got up and remounted his horse, destined for another house half a mile to the rear. As he rode, the pain became excruciating, and he was helped down, laid on a blanket, and given some brandy. He revived and got back on his horse. Luckily for him, he recovered quickly because another solid shot hit the blanket on which he was laying. At a tent near the Bullock House, Hooker made his headquarters. George Meade, the 5th Corps commander, came to Hooker and told him that the 5th and 1st Corps could still move on the enemy's left while the rest of the line held, but Hooker wouldn't take the advice. Soon he called the 2nd Corps commander, Darius Couch, to his headquarters. Hooker said, "Couch, I turn command of the army over to you. You will withdraw it and place it in the position designated on this map." Couch organized the withdrawal closer to the river, and Sedgwick, near Fredericksburg, made good headway, but more Confederates were turning to confront Sedgwick now that it looked like Hooker was firmly on the defensive. By the evening of May 4th, Hooker was back to his old self, except for some pain. That night, Hooker called his corps commanders together and asked for their opinion as to what to do next. Of the 5 corps commanders at the meeting, 3 advised something offensive, and 2 said to withdraw. Hooker believed withdrawal was the best option and ordered the army to start departing the battlefield the next day. He also ordered Sedgwick's 6th Corps to move to the north side of the Rappahannock River. Daniel Butterfield went to Washington to inform the president of the withdrawal. When he did, the president paced back and forth, saying, my God, what will the country say?" As the army was preparing to move across the river, Hooker and some of his troops were across, but a heavy rain set in, making it difficult to cross. Most of the army was on the other side of the river, leaving Couch back in command of those troops. A staff member was sent across the river to plead with Hooker to fight it out, but the orders were to withdraw as soon as possible. When the army made it back to their camps, the same ones they thought they would not occupy again, Hooker sent out a general order congratulating the men on the campaign, telling them that they had surprised the enemy, delivering heavier blows than they received, capturing 5,000 prisoners, and destroying a lot of Southern resources. Hooker's braggadocious ways returned, but the fact that he was defeated began to echo through the country. The defeat made the Northern public turn on the new commander. The General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, visited the army personally to interview various generals about the battle. He came away with the idea that the defeat and the withdrawal was unnecessary and blamed Hooker wholeheartedly. The Committee on the Conduct of the War favored Hooker and did their best to assuage the fears of the public and the politicians about Hooker's ability, going so far as to bring commanders who participated in the battle to testify to Hooker's sobriety during the engagement. Lincoln called his cabinet together to discuss their next steps. The president was convinced to give Hooker a little more time. Lincoln commented that if Hooker had been killed by the shot which knocked over the pillar that stunned him, we should have been successful. One soldier wrote, "Uncle Joe has bit off more than he could chew, and in attempting to swallow it, has got choked." Another wrote, "Hooker stands low in the estimation of the army as the truth about Chancellorsville comes out. Sickles, Butterfield, and Hooker are the disgrace and bane of the army. They are thrice humbugs, intriguers, and demagogues." Hooker remained in command of the Army of the Potomac, but his next test would come quickly after the Battle of Chancellorsville. By June, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was on the move, and moved so rapidly that Hooker's cavalry and the intelligence they and others brought to him claimed that Lee seemed to be everywhere at once. However, one thing was for sure: Lee was heading north. Hooker began to move the army and his headquarters north, closer to Washington, D.C., thinking that Lee was going to interpose himself between the army and the capital. Hooker's turn in fortune resulted in a significant change. Before Chancellorsville, Hooker conversed directly with the president, bypassing the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck. Now, Lincoln was referring all military matters to Halleck. Hooker made suggestions for countering Lee's push northward, but Halleck countermanded every suggestion. For example, Hooker wanted to send the majority of his cavalry north to get information and blunt Lee's invasion, and use the cavalry stationed in Washington to guard the army's flanks as it pushed northward, but Halleck wouldn't allow the Washington cavalry to leave the capital. Numerous suggestions by Hooker were turned down by Halleck. Hooker's lack of information on the Confederate Army concerned him greatly, and to confuse Lee, he sent a message to all newspapers asking them not to divulge the location of any of the Federal units, to not publish any War Department reports, and to have reporters sign all their published letters. For doing this, Hooker stated, "These rules being observed, every facility possible will be given to the reporters and newspapers in this army, including the license to abuse or criticize me to their heart's content." It took until June 25th for the Army of the Potomac to move across the Potomac River, with Hooker making his headquarters at Poolesville, Maryland, on the 26th. 10,000 men were at Harper's Ferry, and Hooker wanted to use them to augment his force and to also keep them from getting captured in the indefensible area. Hooker went to Harper's Ferry on the 27th and wired Halleck saying, "I find 10,000 men here in condition to take the field. Here they are of no earthly account. They cannot defend a ford of the river, and as Harper's Ferry is concerned, there is nothing of it. All the public property could have been secured tonight, and the troops marched to somewhere they could have been of some service. Now they are but bait for the rebels should they return." General William H. French was the garrison's commander and Hooker's old West Point classmate. When Hooker ordered him to abandon Harper's Ferry, French, with permission from Hooker, wired Halleck for confirmation. The wire came back, "Pay no attention to General Hooker's orders." Angered over the humiliation, he remarked to an old friend and cavalry officer, "Halleck's dispatches severs my connection with the Army of the Potomac." At 1 o'clock, Hooker asked to be relieved. Lincoln accepted the resignation and named George Meade the commander of the Army of the Potomac. On June 28th, Meade was informed of the change, and the new commander, after protesting being made commanding general, visited Hooker. They discussed the position of the army. Then Hooker drew up General Orders No. 66. It praised Meade and asked the army to give him support. It went on to say, "Impressed with the belief that my usefulness as the commander of the Army of the Potomac is impaired, I part from it, yet not without the deepest emotion. The sorrow of parting with the comrades of so many battles is relieved by the conviction that the courage and devotion of this army will never cease nor fail. Hooker then left for the railroad at Frederick, Maryland. There he boarded a train for Baltimore, where he was to await orders at the Adjutant General's office.